So I've told you before that I was raised in a family with 6 children, and 5 of us were born within 7 years of each other. There's this 5-year gap to the oldest. My mother used to say, I have 5 children and Elaine, who was my oldest sister. She was kind of gone before we actually figured out what it was to be a family. But there were 5 of us there, and you can imagine how difficult it was for my mother to keep track of us all when we were out and about. So if we went to a shopping mall or some other public place, all of us together, my mother would tell us if we got lost to go to the car. And then she would know where to find us. Our instinct, of course, was to run around screaming her name and panicking at the thought that she might be gone. But more often than not, we would go to the car and she would find us there. Now, it didn't happen all the time. I don't want you to think she was a negligent parent, just going, go to the mall, kids, and return to the car. But it did happen from time to time. Survival experts tell us that one of the reasons it is difficult to find people when they're lost in the woods is because they keep moving. If they just stayed in one place, rescuers more often than not would find them much sooner. But people, being human, they panic, and we search and we're frantic, and we believe that if we try hard enough or search hard enough, we will find our way to safety. This is kind of a metaphor for our lives. There are times when we find ourselves lost, without a compass, frantic to find our way, afraid we will never be found. These are the rough places of our lives, the times when we feel alone in our pain, like we've dropped into a crevice or we're lost in the woods. Sometimes when we find ourselves here, we search for God and we wonder where God could be while we are in such turmoil. We feel like that lost sheep or that lost coin. We're misplaced and unseen. But I guess for me, the real lesson of our text today is that as much as we try to find God in the rough places of our life, it's kind of like we're moving when we should be still. Because we do not find God in the tough spots. God finds us. I have a good friend who is gay. Coming out and living into his truth wasn't easy for him. He had been raised in a somewhat religious home and had embraced his faith in a significant way in his teen and young adult years. At the same time, he was becoming aware of his sexuality, and for him and the people in his church who were his closest friends, being gay was not an option. And so he set out on a quest to cure the gay, as they say. And he read books, and he attended aversion therapy courses, and he made friends who resisted giving in just as he did. Through all of this, he searched to find God. He prayed and he cried and he struggled to be true to what he felt his faith demanded of him. And all the while, he kept his secret. He pretended that he was straight to those he met. He kept up the appearances, and he stayed in the closet where he felt safe and protected. And then, one day, as he looked at that stack of books he had accumulated on how to pray away the gay, all of them promising to fix him, he realized that he could do no more. And he let go, and he sat there in his closet that he had created to protect himself, lost and alone. And then he says God showed him unconditional love. Because when we are stuck in our closets, afraid to show ourselves, wanting desperately to be seen and known, tired of trying to make ourselves more acceptable for society or family or some unknown other, and we finally give that up and surrender, that's when God finds us. Several years ago, my sister-in-law had a recurrence of leukemia. She'd gone 17 months in remission, and then one day she began to cough, and it wouldn't go away. The doctor had told her that if she got to 18 months, she would be considered cured. We had been so hopeful, and so with this news, our family was devastated. It'd been a rough few years. Several of us had been going through cancer treatment, and my parents had had difficult heart issues, and it felt like we were surrounded by sickness and tragedy. I didn't visit her at first because I honestly believed she would recover, and we had a difficult relationship anyway. But when we were finally given the news that she was not going to make it, I went to see her, and we had a heart-to-heart. And there was a healing that happened between us for sure in that place. But watching someone who is only 53 deteriorate, have a bone transplant, enter a hospice, and spend her days in and out of consciousness was incredibly difficult. My brother is a person of great faith, and he would write me and his friends and family about what God was teaching him through this journey. I, of course, struggled with the whole idea that God really had anything to do with it at all, and I certainly didn't think God's purpose in all of this was to teach us things. So I guess when I would get his emails, they'd make me want to scream. God did not do this. Her death is a tragedy, pure and simple. Do not look for purpose or answers in what is completely senseless. Near the end, all I could do was sit at her side and sing to her. I don't know if this comforted her, but it did me. And when she died, I struggled to understand if God was in this at all. And then about 2 days later, I had a vision or a dream. Even now, when I remember, it seems so real, where she came to me. She was in her hospital bed, but she looked at me and her face was angelic. And though we had a difficult relationship when she was alive, she smiled at me with a love that was overwhelming. And she said to me these words, "You were right." And I immediately knew in my heart that she was telling me that life beyond is not a place where only a few are loved and where others are erased. She was telling me that God's love was big and expansive and welcoming to all. And what I understood in a new way was that with all our attempts to find God or to find salvation or to figure out what God is teaching us, we will never find God or understand God's mystery. But if we sit in the moment, in our grief, not knowing which way to turn, God finds us. 15 years ago today, I got up as usual. My husband was working in Fort McMurray, and so he had left already to catch his plane. I turned on the TV to CBC, as I always did. I was making breakfast for my children, and in the midst of getting them ready for school, I saw on the news one of the Twin Towers in New York was on fire. Apparently, they said some plane had accidentally hit the building. But as I watched the television, a second plane came and hit the other tower. And most of you remember the events of that day, how the towers came down, how the ash spread throughout Manhattan, the pictures of people walking across the bridges covered in white dust, the firefighters and police officers entering the buildings to try and rescue those who were injured or stuck above the break. And I remember how horrific it was to hear the sounds of people jumping out of the windows to avoid the flames and landing with that thud. The whole day and the days that followed is seared in my memory, as it is for those of you who are old enough to remember. Many questioned where God is in all of this. Apparently, the perpetrators performed these deplorable acts in the name of God. Others lost their faith and could only sense God's absence. Some felt that this was a punishment from God for our loose values and morals. And others just wanted to lash out and begin what they called a crusade to prove their strength. Some tried to find God again. I remember hearing Sheila Rogers explaining, she's a CBC host as well. She was explaining that though she wasn't very religious, on the Sunday after 9/11, she went to church. She said she didn't know what she was going to find there, but she felt like she needed to go. The church that I served decided to hold a vigil service, and somehow, in that moment that was so incomprehensible, we needed to come together to pray for the victims and ourselves, to sing songs of mourning, to weep for the state of our world, but mostly just to sit and wait for God. Since then, there have been many tragedies, some connected to our frantic need to try and find answers and right those wrongs. And that day continues to cast a shadow over our lives. And we still wonder where God is in all of this, but we don't find God in these heart-wrenching whys, although it is so important to ask those questions. When we are still, God finds us. And on 9/11, God found us in the rubble, in this senseless tragedy, in this overwhelming grief, in the fear and distrust and hopelessness. As we sat in pews, love surrounded us, and God found us in the rubble. And this is the real learning for me from these stories. When we are lost, God finds us. Sure, God is there when we hike up those mountains and we see God in the face of the children and we experience God in our laughter and then our joy. But those are the times when we are home with God. God is there too, laughing with us and smiling at the face of those children and breathing that mountain air. But when we are lost in the rubble of great tragedy, or we are hidden in our closets trying to pretend we are something that we are not, or desperately trying to understand how grief can possibly transform into joy, when we are lost, God finds us. For me, the most human of moments, the times when we are stripped bare, where all illusion is past, where we have nothing but ourselves, lost in the cracks of life, that is the most sacred time of all. That is the time that God finds us. And so this ritual of ours that we had today, our communion, is the most human expression of the most sacred moment. Because in this very eating and drinking and sharing, we bring ourselves as we are. This is the table of suffering. This is the table of sacrifice. This is the table of hope. This is the table of new life. This is the table of rebirth. This is the table of transformation. We come to the table of one who suffered and died, but who rose again. We come with our doubts and our grief, aware that we are lost. And at the table, God finds us. Amen.